everything that I write is kind of the same thing. How do I start expressing myself or my experiences in a different way?
Welcome to another coaching conversation. I'm joined by Shiksha Dheda. So Shiksha is a writer, she's an engineer, and she's a human, and that's taken from her website. And she also has a really fantastic debut poetry collection out. And the fragments, or these little distressed nuggets from my mind, as Shiksha says in the foreword, they depict the physical and the metaphysical struggle that she experiences with obsessive compulsive disorder and depression. Shiksha stood out for me because she has created a really fantastic video sequence, so you can literally read the collection with her by watching all of the videos. Welcome, Shiksha.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. I'm very, very honored to be here. I've watched some of your videos. They are very informative, and you handle the people that you converse with such care. And I know that this is going to be a very, very useful and safe space for me. So I'm looking forward to it. I think for me, with my first collection, it's been a culmination of a lot of my experiences. A lot of the poems were written last year or the year before, but there are a handful of them that were written close to 10 years ago. So when I curated the collection, I sort of put in basically a lot of myself over the years, which is great because it's my debut collection. It's something which I feel really does represent me in a book form. But now it leaves me in a very sort of strange liminal space, because when I write new things, which has been difficult for me the last year, because I feel like everything that I write is kind of the same thing. How do I start expressing myself or my experiences in a different way without repeating what I've said in my debut collection? So it's like I'm writing it, but I feel like, have I reached the bottom of the well with what I have to say about this? Am I being redundant? Am I saying the same thing over and over again? Like they have a whole collection. They have 57 poems of how I feel about my journey with mental illness. So what more can I say that's new?
You said that you were writing new poems, but you're looking at them thinking that you're saying the same thing. How would you like to be experiencing the writing process? Like, if you weren't thinking to yourself, oh, I feel like the barrel's empty, I feel like I'm saying the same thing, what would you like to be thinking in your mind as you're writing these new poems?
I think one of the big problems also is that I don't necessarily have a straightforward writing process. So sometimes, like I know recently I wrote 4 poems sort of in the same day, because there was a submission call that I wanted to submit to, and it was the deadline. But then on other days I don't write anything for weeks, sometimes months. And then what happens is I'll start with an idea and say, okay, this is an interesting submission call. Like the submission call was about writing about physics in poetry. So it's like, no, this is really interesting. I want to write about this. And somehow it reached the same place about my mental illness. And I was like, I as a writer started feeling like I'm tired of reaching the same destination despite what journey I take. And I don't know if my readers feel that way, but that is how I felt when I reread it. And I was like, I mean, I like the way the poem came out, but I feel like I've said this in like 10 different ways already. So it's more of a reflection where I'm like, I wanted to go to B and I ended up at A again, just taking a longer route. So yeah, it's only something that happens after I reflect back, not really while I'm writing the actual poem.
In terms of the poems that you're writing at the moment, I know you mentioned your writing process, which we will look at, but what would you say at the moment you feel is working?
I think for me, because I tend to, as I said, I've written primarily about my own mental illness. I think when I'm given a writing prompt or something which is unrelated, I think that really helps the writing process. I have a chapbook coming out later on this year, with the Daily Drunk magazine, which focuses on sort of movies. So it's very pop culture based. And there are a few which do touch on mental illness, but a lot of the aesthetic of the mag and of the chapbook is not my usual aesthetic. Like a lot of the pieces are even written in listicle form, which I haven't used at all in my debut collection. So I think sometimes if I'm given sort of a mold to shape my writing into, or a direction to take it, to sort of take myself into, as opposed to me molding something. So usually my writing process would be, here's a piece of clay, let me mold it how I want to mold it, which I mean every creator's dream is that, because you want your vision to be authentically you. But I think at this point, because I feel a bit of in a slump, it's a bit easier if someone's like, okay, here's a piece of clay, and this is basically, we want you to create sort of a plate, but you can make this plate, however large you want it to be, or you can add whatever other details you want. I think definitely that has helped me trying to fit into an aesthetic that's not completely mine, or a prompt which I otherwise wouldn't have written about.
So that's working, the prompts and the molds and the constraints and the aesthetic. What would you say is the main thing that you would love to change? Like if you could just let go of that would really make a difference.
You did mention craft earlier on, and I actually don't write a lot of formal poetry. I'm not familiar with a lot of forms because I don't have sort of a formal qualification in writing. So like I'm only familiar with a handful, but there are a lot of, I think, sort of forms of writing, which I feel if I give myself that restraint, it will be easier for me to try and get out of this liminal space. Because if I tell myself, okay, write a golden shovel, maybe it will take me in another direction. Because when I tell myself, write how you feel, which is what I usually do, and then I construct my free verse into sort of visual poetry or shape poetry. But it starts off with me not having that restraint or constraint. So I think if I try and actually work more on the craft of writing, because I would say right now it would be maybe 70% what I want to, how I feel, and 30% craft. I think maybe if that becomes more 50-50, maybe that will help.
It's interesting, as I'm listening to you, I have a sense that you already clearly know some of the answers.
I don't think it's more that I know the answer. I think it's sort of a broad, sort of high level notion of what could be a solution, but not implementing it. Maybe because I don't want to venture in there yet, because there's something that may be holding me back, which I don't know yet.
I almost have a sense of what that resistance might be, this difference of just like the freedom of letting those feelings out on the page versus having to fit into a different kind of space.
Yeah, I actually think you could have kind of touched on that, because I think one of the things which I value about myself, not just as a writer in general, is I would like to think that I'm very authentic. I would like to think that I may not be a lot of things, but I am authentic. And perhaps if I put in the restraint, I'd feel, as you said, that I am compromising on that. I'm compromising on my feelings or my thoughts being authentic, because now I am restricting them or restraining them. So I definitely think it does bring in sort of the question, and I think there was discourse on Twitter as well about this, about poetry as a form of emotion and poetry as a form of craft. I think many people feel that when you use it purely as a form of emotion, it kind of loses its elevation compared to things like memes or sort of TikTok videos. It becomes sort of similar to that if you don't include the craft. I think someone also mentioned that they don't appreciate when people write things that are too personal, which I mean, I personally don't agree with. I think you can, if that's what you're comfortable with. But I think maybe the reason why I am not eager to delve into that notion is I don't want to compromise on my authenticity. So that might be a prejudice that I have, that giving into craft is forsaking authenticity, which isn't the case.
We might refer to this as a belief, something that we believe. I believe that if I give in to craft, I'm going to sacrifice my authenticity. But also, I noticed, like, within the same breath, you questioned that belief.
I think I think as a writer, you need to be authentic to your work. So if you express yourself in a more restricted or restrained way, using sort of more craft, that doesn't mean that you're compromising on authenticity. And maybe because I myself, like I mentioned, don't really have a background in sort of poetry or literature, maybe that's why I feel that if I introduce that now, after I have written so many pieces without it, that then I'll compromise on my authenticity. Where somebody who may have a formal training in poetry and in literature, for them, sticking to craft may be their version of authenticity. So that's why I'm not sure and on the belief completely, because I think it does vary from person to person. But I think for me personally, I can't evaluate how sure I am about that unless I have involved craft at least 50%, then I'd make a strong stance on my belief.
Earlier on, you were talking about looking at your poems and thinking, you know, this feels like the same old, have I scraped the barrel? There's authenticity in that experience too. So we've got the authenticity of, I'm just going to write what I feel, or the authenticity of like, well, this is also how I feel, that I don't necessarily want to be going over the same terrain. So it's interesting. It just depends in which direction you're looking at through that lens of authenticity.
Yeah, I think that's very important what you mentioned, that it doesn't necessarily have to be productive, or we don't necessarily have to feel sort of good about our work at every particular point for it to be authentic. We can look at something and say, well, I'm not completely happy with this, or I'm not at the point where I'd like to be with my craft. That is, as you mentioned, a type of authenticity as well. So I think what's important in the whole thing of writing, whether it's craft based or sort of more emotional based, is to be honest. And I think that's what I try and do, because I want to be honest with myself firstly, and I also want to be honest with my readers. Because when you write about something like mental illness especially, I think a lot of it, even despite the fact that discussions have become more commonplace about it, there's a lot of the not very pleasant side which people still don't really openly discuss. And if I sort of euphemize that or don't portray that authentically, I feel like it would be dishonest to myself and to other people who may be waiting for somebody to discuss that more rawly or more honestly.
Let's come back to what you said in terms of, because it's not something that you feel, I can't remember your exact language, so, you know, correct me if I haven't quite got you with this, but I got a sense that you don't feel entirely comfortable or confident really walking those terrains of fixed craft or very strict constraints. And so there's a sense that in that short term, it might be limiting, but I'm wondering about that long-term vision.
I think your question is really good in the sense that I think in terms of long term, it definitely would be a result that I would be pleased with, I think, because I think with any craft, it will get better and better. But I think at the point I am in, it's, as you mentioned in the beginning, that on my website, it says that I'm a writer, an engineer, and a human. It's because I don't know which direction I myself want to go in right now. I sort of turned to writing when I felt that I had reached a roadblock or sort of a slump in other aspects of my life. And now to sort of jump into craft and to sort of dedicate a lot of time into my own writing, I think I'd need to acknowledge to myself that this is a direction that I want to seriously take, and it may hold sort of more importance than other labels, for lack of a better phrase, that I kind of label myself as at this point. And I think I'm unsure which direction to take. That's why I may be hesitant to go in that direction because I feel like it will take up a lot of sort of mental and emotional energy, and I don't know if I'm ready for that yet. Like a lot of the work I do now is editing, and that's great to see other people's work, to get inspired by their work. But I think if I have to make the decision to sort of focus on craft in my writing, I think I'll have to make an active, conscious decision that this is something that I now want to take to the next level in my own life. So I think that's where the hesitancy comes from. But I do
Yeah.
think if I do put in that effort in the long term, I think personally I would be pleased with the results.
Tell me more about that hesitancy, because I'm hearing you say, I can see that that long term could be rewarding, but I don't know which direction I want to go in.
I think I reached a point with my own, with engineering as well. I'm doing my master's right now. So after that, I then need to decide what is it that I want to do with engineering. But then at this point, I also enjoy writing. And I have enjoyed my experience actively submitting and actively working on my writing in the sort of last 18 months. So I think the hesitancy is that I'm not sure which option would be the best for me, because when you make these decisions, you base them on obviously how you are at present, and you don't know what would change in the future, which I mean, nobody really does, but there isn't one particular option which sticks out for me. Like for some people, they're like, no, I am a writer. I can't imagine doing anything else. And I haven't reached that position with anything that I sort of do yet. I don't see myself as, no, I'm purely an engineer, I'm purely a writer, or I'm purely an editor. I enjoy these things, but at the same time, I don't feel like any one sticks out more than the other. So that's perhaps the hesitancy, is sort of trying to give one more leeway and then let the others fall back. I don't think I'm confident in any of those fields enough to make that decision.
Yeah, and when you said what's best for me, tell me a little bit about that criteria. What do you mean by best for you?
For me, it would be what makes me feel more fulfilled than the other things. What makes me feel that I can grow as an individual in this space. So, like with writing, for instance, I do think that there is scope for me to grow more, but I also know from my own experiences that it is a very competitive field. It is very difficult. There are people who write exceptionally well, and they get rejected all the time. Although, I mean, all writers get rejected all the time, but some people have worked for years on a manuscript, and the manuscript is good. It deserves to be read, but it just doesn't find the right publisher or the right press, and that is a bit of luck. I would imagine a lot of luck is in the process. So from somebody like me who just came into this sort of publishing, writing world recently, when I've spoken to other people, a lot of them do say that they enjoy writing, but they don't find that fulfillment. So I think writing would always be a part of my life, but to take it seriously to the level that I think it would deserve for me to do justice to it, I think I'll have to prepare myself for that. That just because I have put in the effort doesn't always mean that it will translate into sort of publication success. So I think it becomes difficult for me to evaluate how fulfilling that would be in the long term as well.
So, what might be a reason now that writing continues to play a part in your life?
I think that's a very good question, because I found myself, despite never really sort of formally taking up writing, that whenever I have sort of felt that I'm not finding fulfillment in other things, I have subconsciously or unintentionally turned to writing. Like this has happened before. It's just this is the first time where I've said, no, I actually want to take this to the next level now. I want to submit my writing to other places. So I feel that the reason why I might always turn to writing is I feel that it expresses the way I feel more than any other thing does. I also feel that I have more sort of leniency with it. Even if I think about engineering, I have tried to add in sort of aspects of myself into my research. And I mean, I have been happy with the outcome of that as well. But I think writing does more justice to being a representation of myself than other things do. So I think that's also where the authenticity comes in again. So I think maybe I sort of always default to writing because I feel that it is more authentically myself and the way that I as an individual communicate better than in any other means.
Tell me about what you notice when you think, okay, on one level, writing can simply be a space that I go to, excuse me, to learn and practice the craft, to find my authentic self, or writing can be about success and publication.
I feel like if you do something which you really enjoy and you feel that it authentically represents you, I would personally want to be known for that more than I would want to be known for any other thing. So if I could be known as, this is Shiksha, the writer, or this is Shiksha as in the engineer, and if I had to choose between being successful in one of those fields, I think it would be the former, because that is more authentically who I am. So that's why when I think it's strange, because it kind of links something which I enjoy doing and something which I am more emotional about to something which I would like to see tangible or external success in. I think in some way, I'm not sure if for me personally that would say that this validates my authenticity. I don't know if that makes sense, because now I am internally fulfilled by this as well as externally. So this must be the proper culmination of how I am.
It's interesting because you're saying that if you could choose, and if you had a sense of where this path was going to lead, like if it was going to lead to a level of success, you would choose Shiksha the writer.
It's interesting because one of the reasons why I sort of didn't default to that is because I come from a very sort of STEM-based family. And I know when I did enjoy writing, my mother was like, yes, you can write, but after you get your degree. So it's kind of like, it's not something that I think was actively encouraged. So that probably has influenced sort of my career choice as well. That's why it wasn't a clear-cut decision for me in the beginning.
And it's great to be aware of that, those opinions of other people. So again, we're just looking at how someone else's perspective of writing is very different to your own. Like I'm hearing that your perspective is like writing is the space where I'm myself. Writing is what I would choose if I knew that it was going to lead to fulfillment and to growth. Those are the words that you use when you talked about best for me, fulfillment and growth. You didn't talk about productivity or success. It was simply fulfillment and growth. And then now I'm understanding why there is that fear or that doubt of, is this going to go anywhere? Because we've got all of these onlookers who have their own requirements. If those onlookers weren't here, and if you really were free to choose, if you could have that magic wand and choose how you approached your poetry over the next 6 months, what would you choose?
I think I would choose to focus completely on it, to be honest. I would choose to focus on my writing. I would choose to focus on developing sort of a niche for myself, like fully fledging out how I would like to be as a writer. And I think more than sort of other people's perspectives, which does come into play, is that we're sort of geared up to think that we need to do something with our life which will sort of bring in financial stability, which we will sort of be able to build a livelihood from. In an ideal society, I think if everyone was allowed to do what they felt that they were most fulfilled in, then I would definitely choose writing.
In that space of freedom, in that space of the magic wand, you would choose over the next 6 months to completely focus on your writing.
Yeah.
If you were to speak to a favourite poet of yours, someone who you've read or someone that you admire, what advice do you think they would give you?
Well, at this point, I'm thinking of Emily Dickinson, and she is a famous poet, so she would probably tell me to do that. I'm guessing she'd probably tell me to focus on writing, definitely. So I
Okay.
think many people would say that actually that you should do what makes you most fulfilled, and ideally that would be best. But I don't think I'm in a space in other aspects of my life to be able to. I want to use the word afford that privilege to just focus on something which would fulfill me first, and then sort of meet my other needs.
How can you make that choice in a way that feels possible? Like if you were to think about how you explore your writing over the next 6 months.
Well, in some level, I've kind of tried to do this with engineering. So when we had to do our honors project, I sort of steered away from something that was hardcore technical, and I sort of went towards something which was basically it was interactive gaming to help with anxiety management. So I try to involve something which I feel passionate about, sort of mental illness, mental health awareness, and sort of incorporate that into something that was technical. So I think at this point, what I'm trying to do, and I don't know how possible it is I'm trying to sort of, if you have a Venn diagram, I'm trying to find the intersectionality between sort of what I want to do, sort of writing, and sort of engineering as well. And I feel like if there is an overlap, then I kind of give myself that freedom to work within all of those spaces and yet still be authentic and yet still do things which I find fulfilling. So I think I would need to actively incorporate things which may not be directly linked and make those links. I would have to sort of be the bridge of communication between separate fields, for lack of a better phrase. So I think looking for that niche space, I think is something that I will actively have to look out for. I think.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about this.
I know, for instance, I wanted to kind of work on a game which sort of was a choose your own adventure game which incorporated poetry, but then also I wanted it to be sort of a first person perspective to show the player how it feels when you have obsessive compulsive disorder. So something like that would incorporate something which I feel passionate about, which is sort of mental health awareness. It would incorporate poetry and it would incorporate aspects of sort of game development and engineering. So I would ideally like to work on stuff which sort of incorporate a lot of things, but then again, then that brings me to the same sort of roadblock about finding the time now to work on each of those things separately to sort of hone that craft to make it better. It's kind of like the saying when they say you're a jack of all trades. I wouldn't even say I am, but it just feels like I'm doing a lot of things sort of at 50% capacity, and I need to set aside time to get each thing at a more refined level. So I think finding the time for that is going to be the real challenge, because each sort of field does deserve its own time to develop fully before I can sort of amalgamate all of them. So I think that's maybe the hindrance here, finding the time to work on each thing separately.
I'm curious about hindrance, and again, let's just pan out a little bit because I think there's a different time scale when we're working on more than one field at once. In terms of when we're just working on one project and we're giving it all our time, it's completed sooner. But when we're
Yeah.
working, in your case, when you've got these three fields, you've got mental health, you've got engineering, and you've got writing, just simply because there's three, it's going to take longer. So I'm wondering if perhaps you're giving yourself a hard time because you're simply not appreciating, I just need a bit longer so each of them get their fullness.
That's definitely a part of it, because when you try and sort of spread yourself quite thin in different areas, obviously, as you said, you're trying to incorporate a lot of things, so it will take longer. But then it also reaches a point where you feel like I'm putting in this effort in so many different aspects, so why am I not seeing any results? And then when you start questioning that, that's when you stop losing momentum and you start thinking, is this going to reach its destination? Will I see the end product? Because you're putting your energy into so many different things, your wait, obviously, as you said, is longer, but that also means that you need to motivate yourself for longer, because you don't get sort of that fulfillment of completion that you would if you were only focusing on sort of one project. So I think maybe that's the lengthening of time, and using more energy also is more emotionally demotivating because you don't see a result as quickly as you'd like.
And it sounds like you're making that mean something.
Well, I would be lying if I said that when I start a project, I definitely know it would reach the end. I think even if I just think about my masters, I think there have been a lot of roadblocks. At some point, I stopped working on it. Then I restarted working on it. Then I wanted to change direction in it. So for me to be completely confident and say that it will reach where I want it to would be dishonest, because sometimes when I do start a project, I myself don't have the conviction that it will be complete. Even though I would like to complete it, I'm not 100% convinced that I will see the end product of it. So yeah, your observation is definitely spot on.
Let me give you a metaphor here, Shiksha, which is, and perhaps you're aware of this, the difference between a child growing up with one language and the moment at which they start speaking versus a child growing up who's either learning two or three at once. I don't know if you're aware of the research that's done around this, but children learning two or three, they actually start to speak later.
Yeah.
But when they start to speak, they speak three languages.
Okay, that's very interesting. I actually wasn't aware of that, because I can speak three languages, but I didn't learn them at the same time. So that's why for me that wasn't something that I applied in my real life. I first got the base of my home language, which is actually English. Then when I went to school, I sort of learned another language, and then the third language I kind of picked up. So for me, I've never had to do all those things at once. So that's very interesting. I wasn't aware of that.
What I'm sensing is that you simply haven't experienced the payoff of working on two or three things at once. But that's why I love that research, because it's a wonderful metaphor that we can use that says, okay, I may not be speaking as quickly as everybody else who's already achieving success, but when I am there, I'm going to be speaking three languages. Or in your case, when I am there, I'm going to have found a way to incorporate games and engineering and poetry and mental health and mental illness. So I wonder if that might be just a useful totem to use to guide you to have a little bit more faith in that end product.
That does help, actually, a lot, because I think when you work on a lot of things, you kind of feel as though you're splitting your energy and you won't see the end result, but it's very possible that you will.
Shiksha, let's just take a moment to reflect on today's coaching conversation. I'd like for you to just cast your eye or your mind back over the last 40 minutes or so, and perhaps share something that you feel that you know now that you didn't know before we started talking today.
I would say there's two things, and one would be that incorporating sort of a restraint into what you do doesn't necessarily make it less authentic, especially if you have an end goal, or you are incorporating that restraint because you want to maintain your authenticity. And then secondly, I think it would be that just because you are working on a lot of different things and don't see immediate results doesn't mean that you won't at some point, which I think is something which I need to tell myself a lot. I think sometimes I don't see sort of the light at the end of the tunnel, but that doesn't mean it's not there.
There's an interview that comes to mind, and the name of the guest who's being interviewed has escaped me, but the conversation of the interview is very much about how many people who have achieved a level of success, if you look back on their career trajectory, they've done many things along the way, and that doing those many things along the way is actually one specific ingredient to reaching a level of success. So I think it's an interview that you're going to enjoy listening to. So once we finish this, I will look it up and I'll share the link with you. And also, folks, I'll share it in the description below, because I see myself as a multi-passionate entrepreneur. So I really resonate with what you shared today, this idea of like, how can I do all of these things but not feel like I'm not producing anything? Shiksha, thank you so much for being with me today. And we will be putting a link to your website below. We'll be putting a link to your Amazon page below as well, where people can find your collection washed away. Is there anything else that you want to share or add before we finish?
Firstly, I'd just like to thank you for having this chat. It was very useful, actually. I think you asked questions which were very insightful and caused me to introspect a lot. Actually, in the last 40 minutes, I think that was a lot of introspection. And also, yeah, I really enjoyed your usage of the language metaphor. That's something which I think I will go back on. And I think what's very important for me as a takeaway from here is that sometimes restraining ourselves in something which should be creative doesn't necessarily mean that it's not creative anymore. And that's an idea which has been reinforced in our chat. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thank you very much.